This session follows on from the two previous ones in several ways. Open House Melbourne has got its overall themes of stories of the city. St Mark's is a window on some of the stories of the city. And running through some of the displays here today is what you might call a sub-theme around textiles. We started with Betsy, and beyond Betsy's work, Ellen's work. We were connecting through Cecilia's stoles. And this session, point of departure, is the AIDS quilts. It also links to where Cecilia got to in her final comments in response to Kate's question. This church, multiple generations, has a long, long history of inclusion. It starts in the poverty of this area. In the late decades of the 1900s and into the early parts of the 20th century. It continues with migrants. And the chapter we're particularly interested in this session is the AIDS crisis, the inclusion of the gay community at a time when the city was, not just the city, the country, was not interested in including. And there's other dimensions of inclusion too that maybe people will bring out in discussion. John Hall from Thorn Harbour Health, for whom we have many things to thank, starting with these quilts that are on loan to us for Open House Melbourne, and Matt Hadgraft. So John has a connection to St Mark's from way back in the 1980s, at the time of the AIDS crisis. Matt's connection to St Mark's is much more recent. As one of our favourite choristers, he sings for us some Sundays, but also speaking from different generations. So we can start by talking about the AIDS crisis, and maybe that'll flow on into wider themes of inclusion. Let me say, before I throw the microphone over to these guys, if anyone would like to come in with a question or a comment at any point, please do so, because we'd quite like to get some discussion going backwards and forwards, so no need to save them for the end. John, I'm going to suggest we start with you. Again, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Perhaps you could start, particularly for the people that weren't here in Melbourne, recreate the time for us, recreate the early days of the crisis, and how St Mark's comes into that picture. Over to you, and please put your hand up if our voices get too low for you at any point, okay?
I'll project as best I can. Really, when I look back, I think anyone who lived through those terrible days, we're not untouched by that experience. I think there's a degree of trauma that goes as part of our lives henceforth. They were terrible days. Not only was there stigma to the people with HIV, which emanated from the highest places, from politicians to church leaders, to churches, undertakers. Little was understood in the early days, and so no one knew what they were dealing with. And of course, we've all seen the ad on TV back in the 80s, the Grim Reaper ad. That certainly put the conversation on the dinner table, everyone's dinner table, but it also led to further stigma for those affected by or infected by HIV. But also, St Mark's is very important because many undertakers wouldn't touch bodies. Many churches refused to have services or burials or funerals for people who, double whammy. Not only HIV positive, but gay, so that's no good. But St Mark's was very different, as it always has been. It's part of its DNA. So we have both a historic connection with St Mark's at Thorn Harbour Health, which was the Victorian AIDS Council, and but not only just the history, but the values as well. Because St Mark's is one of the few places where people could be themselves. Families could come here, grieving partners could come here, and you did funerals. You had an AIDS mass on World AIDS Day. I think it might have been on the eve of World AIDS Day, Kate, the eve of World AIDS Day. And also there was an AIDS chapel up the back. So we're forever interconnected. You set an example of good Christian values. And that was lacking so often in the early days of the crisis. We've come a long way. It's hard to believe that was so bad. I mean, we seem to have come a long way in a short amount of time, but it hasn't been, I know. People like Kate would realise that. They were terrible days, but you plod along, there's advances, bit by bit by bit. And now of course it's a different world, different dynamic totally, but back in those days, people wouldn't want to be touched by people with HIV or with AIDS. And people died in huge numbers, really. And our volunteers were trained out at Fairfield Hospital. We did volunteers did a 6-week training course, which says something. Actually, the Department of Health commissioned a report about an investigation to what do we do about this disease, because palliative care services failed. They're fine for everything else, but in those days they didn't want to touch anyone who had an infectious disease, which was AIDS. So VAC grew up from the roots. Family members, friends, just the community generally came together. We're trained out at Fairfield Hospital by, I can't remember their names, the people, great nurses. And also we had a link with the Royal District Nursing Service, which is now Bolton Clark. So we looked after people and they died in their homes, more often than not. The Fairfield Hospital was the key hospital, and that was unique, but we'd get them out of the hospital so they could die at home. So, it was trial by fire, really.
Just before we jump across to Matt, John, could you say something about the quilts? We've got 3 on display here,
yes,
but there's a much higher story. These are just three
blocks.
Ones.
And can I just throw in there as well, John, that you said that we chose some of your favourites. Can you say why these are your favourites?
Well, yes. Well, I can. This church also was part of North Support Group, which there was inner North and out of North, and North was the yin and yang symbol. And so we were part of your church. That was just a volunteer support group, the Remembering 100 Men and Women. That was in 1986 to 1992? Yeah. So I was part of that group, but also the one to the right with Les Taylor, there was a national display of the quilts years and years ago, decades ago probably. And at the end of that, it must have been about 96, 97, because antiretrovirals were coming through. And so the Sydney people, the New South Wales people, ACON included, the AIDS Council of New South Wales, decided we should just put the quilts in a museum. And a lot of the Victorian ones were caught up in that. And that one there, it took 14 years of pleading. The family members, Darren Oliver's parents, who has the love, life, lust written on it, they begged for 14 years to have it returned because they made it, and they refused to let it come back. And I went up there and they said, we're not stopping people from accessing the quilts. They can fly up. This is the Powerhouse Museum. We can pull out the tray. It was like a morgue, and they can view it. And they said there's no excuse for them now not coming up because there's cheap airfares. And I said, that's the difference between you and us. You put the price of a cheap airfare on accessing something which is so important to them, which they made in memory of their son. So I went to the ABC, and it was on AM. I was talking on AM, and they reluctantly, they hate me, but they gave it back. You shouldn't have to go through that. And I said, one day I hope they're all in your museum. But it's not over. People still die. in much less numbers. There's still complexities of HIV disease, and we see it as a living document still to remind people, to educate people. The important thing is each quilt is about the size of a cemetery plot. So it was done like that, and it was established out at Fairfield Hospital. And the first World AIDS Day here was 88. But the quilt started in the United States in San Francisco in 85. And it was a safe thing for people to come to remember. And every World AIDS Day at my work at the Positive Living Centre, we hang as many as we can around. Under the guidelines now of Heritage Victoria, it's the only such thing protected by government instrumentality in regard to a pandemic. Nowhere else in the world is an AIDS quilt protected like this. So it's quite unique, I think. But yeah, because I've got Stephen King in the purple. He was the first staff member of VAC to die. Les Taylor was a New Zealand activist, and he helped establish the then Victorian AIDS Council. And Darren's parents were very active in the volunteer program. And I mean, it's like revisiting. And Vaughan Neal, the pale blue one, his mother still comes to the PLC every World AIDS Day. We make sure that's up to visit him. And she's now in care herself. He died around his 24th birthday. So it's got lots of memories for me, and I'm sure other people in the congregation here, and Kate, you would know some of the names up there too, and you'd know about it as well.
With Matt's indulgence, I've got a question over here. Matt, do you mind?
It's not
at all.
It's not so much a question. I just wanted to add to something you were saying about Fairfield.
Yes.
That the Anglican Church appointed Sister Hilda as I don't know what, chaplain, and she did amazing work.
She
with
did.
AIDS people.
That's right. She was a chaplain.
I don't know how she termed applies.
Yes.
There, and I can remember having long conversations with her.
Yes.
During those years, and also at one stage, and I can't remember his name, we had an AIDS sort of officer, special ordained bloke, who was particularly there to actually educate all of us.
Was that Peter?
No,
Father
it wasn't Peter who was here.
Peter used to go out to Fairfield.
Yes.
He was a
it
priest.
might have been before Peter.
Okay.
Well, yes, because Peter wasn't ordained then.
Yeah.
But he was really,
So
really good
this
in
church,
educating us.
the Anglican Church generally, but also this church had strong ties to Fairfield Hospital.
Yeah.
Matt, you've been very patient. Younger guys.
Yes. Well, thanks.
Good. Younger. It's statistics.
I've had a hard life. Certainly a better singer.
Yep.
Matt, just interested, big picture.
Yeah.
Your impression of this story, how it all plays.
Let me paint a picture for you. I'm a child of 79 and I was born in Queensland, in Brisbane. And Queensland, especially in Victoria, is famous for being Hicksville. But when you look at the calibre of our politicians, how can I blame you all? You know, famously, this was the Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen era, and he had crooked cops, everything you can imagine being licentious and wrong with the city was happening under Sir Joh. But I mean, it would be ridiculous to suggest that all Queenslanders were like that, because not everyone voted for him. That's a fact, you know. In that capacity, like in that setting, I was a choir boy at St John's Cathedral, Brisbane. The main thing I want to draw is that I was at the service when Archbishop Hollingworth first ordained women in the Anglican Church, singing in the choir, as one does. And I remember they organised a protest and everything. It was a wonderful, wonderful service. In hindsight, looking back over my shoulder, you know, Mum said, "You realise that lady was a cross-dresser, don't you?" And I'm like, "No, I'm a very naive child like this," but aren't all children naive? These days, St John's is as welcoming, I would say. You get greeted by Terry and old mate, I can't remember his name, but a gay couple welcomes you as you come into the narthex at St John's, Brisbane. It's a very colourful congregation indeed, you know, owing to their ministry. Coming down here, the first time I ever set foot in this church was Palm Sunday 2012. Yeah, and Stuart, the vicar at the time, welcomed me wholeheartedly, and was such a you know, so pastoral was he that ultimately I rented one of the rooms in the vicarage, possibly overstayed my welcome, but it was a very kind thing for him to do. It really helped me set on my feet. So here has always, to me, represented being a very, very inclusive place indeed. I love that we can hang this kind of thing in a church. Go on social media, and I guarantee you, people these days do not associate the church with inclusivity. Can anyone say the word for me? You know what word I'm saying. Inclusivity. Yeah. The gay world and the church seem to be completely separated from one another these days. So it's so important that we have a church like St Mark's that has not only, you know, embraced everyone marginal, which is, I would put to you, what Christ would have done, you know. I'm lucky that, I mean, I saw all the bowling ball ads on TV as a kid, and as a result, people of my generation are very, very careful indeed, I would say. The one turning point was in the 90s. Do you remember the cocktail? It was all of the antiviral drugs. They called it the cocktail because you had to take drugs and drugs and drugs. But people became, once there was a cure, people became willing to be infected because there was the cocktail. So it meant they could have their own lifestyle back. And then that got amplified by PrEP more recently, where people realised that because there was some kind of shield against it, that you could then do what you wanted to do. Problem was that then when COVID came along, people's mindset was, oh, I'm going to catch it in any case, so I may as well get it. They lost a sense of how devastating the illness was. And I think, you know, in places like this, you should never lose sight of just, you know, how precious everyone is and how something can take everyone away from us. It wasn't just people who were infected by HIV who were so badly affected. It was all the partners, and it was all the mothers of the world, all the families, all of the aunts who were kept at arm's distance from a very religious family because they were accepting and they were seen to embrace that kind of thing. You know, the stigma ran far deeper than just people who contracted the thing themselves. But if you come to Mass here at St Mark's, you see everyone come to church, and that's exactly how it ought to be. I feel really fortunate to be in my generation because I don't take for granted all of the, you know, the activism and the hard work that my forebears did. But I also, you know, I really appreciate how many people can be in this one place at one time. Have I even answered your question?
More than answered. Just on Queensland, may I make a comment?
Oh, yes, go for it.
No, it's a very important comment. Because when the Hawke government came to power, Neil Bullock was the health minister, they thought, this strange infectious disease, we've got to do something. We need a different approach. They didn't think it would work from pushing it down, so they thought they would engage with the at-risk, then considered at-risk communities, which were the gay community, injecting drug users and sex workers. Which is was a radical concept to this day. So they started to do that, and they developed a national strategy. And as it turned out, the sex workers are better than anyone else about protecting anybody, themselves or anybody else. But the national strategy was getting off the ground, and the federal government was going to fund these community groups, and they had to engage with them. It was a partnership with those affected at-risk groups. And every state came on board, every state and territory except Queensland. And we had Neil Blue come and speak at work at the Positive Living Centre on One World AIDS Day, and he said, they haven't released the minutes from the cabinet minutes yet, but this is what happened with Queensland. They offered to give money to the state governments to distribute to gay groups, sex worker groups, injecting drug user communities, and BLP Peterson said, we will not touch that tainted money for that lowlife. Quote. and that's on record.
Queensland,
So they
a smart state.
They opted out of then they opted out of the national strategy, and the Catholic nuns came to the party. The Sisters of Mercy became the money laundering arm for the federal government's funds for HIV money. This is a true story. And if you look up the cabinet records now, you'll find that that's verified.
Brilliant.
We've got to be careful with time because I know people have other things to get to. Let me just ask, any questions, comments on anything from anyone in the audience? Was that a hand? No. Ella.
Yes, I just heard you, Matt, when you said, you know, believe it or not, the church and the gay community are not seen as, you know, cross-pollinated, if you like, anymore. And I'm so used to going to liberal churches, I forget that.
Yeah.
It's so important to me. And just coming to Kate's question to Cecilia, how can we, it's so important that as an inclusive space, that we act like that. How can, in your opinion, we be more welcoming? You know, when the tendency is maybe to sort of slip around the sidelines or just to be unconscious in a sense in your little womb-like environment. How could we do it better, maybe?
At the risk of putting...
Hold. Just hold. I'm going to give you two the final word. I'm trying to be really careful with time here. Anyone else want to come in with a question or comment? Kate.
This is a related comment. Those who don't know me, I'm an infectious diseases physician, so I primarily work with positive people.
Thanks for coming, guys.
That question of the gay community versus rather with the church, almost the only time I bring religion into my work is when a patient is having a really tough time. And I will say, may I light a candle for you on Sunday? I have never yet met a gay man who didn't jump at that and say, oh please, and I've had one of them come back and say, Kate, please would you light me a candle because your candles work. So I think it's still there, it's just we've got to find a way to balance it.
So there's two questions on hold for you. Ken, I'd like to draw you in before we give these guys the final word, and it's back to Kate's question about other dimensions of inclusion. And something that I've learned listening to you, which I was quite unaware of, is how much St Mark's is connected to sections of the local Indigenous community, particularly around funerals. Can we get a quick word from you on that, and then we'll close out back with Matt and John.
For those who don't know, St Mark's has a rich history of engaging with the Indigenous community in Fitzroy, going back a long time. And one of the things that I became aware of when I became vicar 15 months ago is that we had a history of Indigenous people having their funerals here because St Mark's has done that freely. And freely I mean we still, if families can't afford a funeral, we work with funeral directors and we don't charge for those funerals at all. But also there's that connection with the Aboriginal community which goes back to the time when the Aboriginal community in Fitzroy was centred down in Gertrude Street, and this was, I meet people from the Indigenous community who see St Mark's as their church. Even though they mightn't come regularly to the church, they still see St Mark's as their church because of that history. And as someone who's been involved in ministry to the Indigenous people for a long time, that's a great source of pride for me, and I think should be for the church as well.
Ken, thank you. Matt, final comments? John, final comments?
As far as integrating the gay community in the church, I think we've both got heavy lifting to do from both sides. From the church's point of view, abandoning all of these, we are not Levites. We do not need to hold the letter of Leviticus to account all the time. Dropping pieces of theology that focus on what men in the desert, thousands of years ago saw as an important thing to preserve the human race, but rather to focus on the love, the outpouring, what is not easy for you to do. It is not easy to love some people, but there is a spark in them that you can concentrate on. I think that's the part as a church, not saying that we don't, but I'm saying that the church broadly ought to be concentrating on how to activate people's compassion and love. From a gay point of view, if you have a group, for example, there's a gay rowing team, you may as well drop off rowing team from the thing, because the minute you attach, gay or LGBTQ or queer to something, it becomes a cruising ground, or can, From the gay perspective, I think giving the church its dues and recognising that it isn't a place to meet other gay men, it's a place to come authentically to, to find what the church is offering. And I don't mean to sound so homophobic or anti-queer when I say that. I just want to say realistically, to recognise the church as a spiritual place, not as a sexual one. I think anyone can belong to the spiritual home that is St. Mark's, no matter who you are. But remember that, there's a time and a place for certain things, but we can all meet on the same level here. I hope people recognise that.
Matt, thank you.
My pleasure.
Look, I'm delighted to be part of this and to come back to St. Mark's, because you've got a fine tradition for decades, and for 100 years. And this is just one of the latest ones with the HIV/AIDS and the gay community. I think this church illustrates Christianity at its best, about inclusion, welcoming, and look at what you achieve. So it's always a safe place for anybody, I think. So I'm pleased to be back here.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks again to Thorn Harbour Health for lending the quilts. Just before I ask you to join me in thanking these guys, particularly anyone who might be a visitor here, if you have any thoughts about anything this church can be doing to reach a segment of the community that you think might appreciate being included, we'd be really pleased to hear from you. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you.